brand new episode of Dive Cuts, and we are live on YouTube for all YouTube subscribers, Rock M Plus subscribers. It's season 9 already, and we are here to talk about your Missouri basketball Tigers. It's been a good week. So we're excited to actually talk about these Missouri basketball Tigers. I am your usual host. I'm here all the time. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see me on your right. I am Sam Snelling. Please take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to us if you aren't already. Helps us grow the channel. To the left, to your left, is Mr. Matt Harris. Matt, how are you?
I'm fine. If you can't tell, there's a lighter lilt in my voice today. That's actually me just thinking about a 2-0 week in basketball and the great bourbon I drank in Louisville last week, and ignoring geopolitical events and the fact that I spent a crap load of money on a new roof over the weekend. But Missouri basketball and bourbon is getting me through, Sam. It's getting me through.
So it's not entirely surprising, but good bourbon, good basketball, especially this time of year, can take you a long way. I did buy a new bottle of Four Roses at the wine and cheese place here in town.
Nice.
They had a single barrel selection, and I sprung for that one. Looking forward to getting that one. But yeah, I think last we talked, we were talking about the possibility of Missouri going 2-0. You had Tennessee at home, and you had a sort of a teetering Mississippi State team on the road, and Mississippi State decided to just full on teeter over, which is fortunate for the Tigers. I don't know how many people were paying attention to their midweek game, but they got firebombed out of Tuscaloosa. Alabama had 63 points at halftime?
63 at the break.
I think they had 16 3-pointers in the first half. So yes, Mississippi State is accustomed to getting blown out this past week in the first half, and similar to Missouri, they were down, I think, 30 at halftime against Alabama, and managed to kind of squeeze it back up to 25 by the end of the game. But and really, Missouri had Mississippi State down. It was
31 at half.
Well, I was going to say in the second half.
Oh yeah, it was 34.
They kind of rattled off a 10-0 run. I'm just like, oh, come on, just stop that. We're really trying to juice the margins at this point to make those PMs look a little better for the Tigers. But yeah, so the win over Tennessee was obviously, the win over Mississippi State, I think, is Missouri sort of holding serve in a way, beating a team that they kind of need to beat to make sure that they don't have any blemishes on their on their resume. But beating Tennessee is a nice mark on your resume, because it's going to be another quad 1 victory, and the more quad 1 wins you can pick up, the more likely you are to be included in the big dance. And so that was sort of like the marquee win. T.O. Barrett was great. Mark Mitchell was great. Mm-hmm. Not everybody else played all that well. We had some nice defensive moments from Trent Burns, and enough made shots from guys like Ant Robinson and Trent Pierce that that the Tigers were able to kind of carry the day. But fortunately for them, Tennessee offense not the most elite, and also struggled to kind of score points, and Missouri was able to kind of win a close one. Any deep thoughts on that game?
This is the best Tennessee offense of Rick Barnes' tenure. That's what some writers out there on the internet told me. This was one of the best offenses of Rick Barnes' tenure, which really should just be Rick Barnes has a really good freshman, and then asks Jacoby Gillespie to do a lot. That's how you translate it. It's nice to see a scout pan out the way you think it will. It's always good to see that, especially for your coaching staff. But I thought that the Tennessee game kind of went the way I thought it was going to go. The start again was not great. Been a couple of home games now where the start hasn't really been all that fast. But I think once Missouri kind of got settled in, got the ball handling under control, the game played out the way I think I expected it to, in a way of, Tennessee was going to ride two guys and see what they could get. it was going to be a slugfest where both teams were going to try and apply rim pressure. It was not going to be an aesthetically pleasing game. It most certainly was not great to watch at times. And, you know, ultimately, I think Missouri was able to do the two things that it needed to do. It was able to isolate mismatches. And, you know, that was getting Mark Mitchell on guys like Dwayne Brown, getting them switches on to bigs that they could drive in space. And as much as I love, you know, Bishop Boswell, I would like Bishop Boswell at Missouri's program. Um, that those guards, you can drive them. And Missouri had big physical guards. And, you know, I think I posted it on Twitter and kind of to our board. Missouri didn't run complicated offense. It basically ran 5-out ball screens and a horn set to give a double gap and some ISOs to TO on Boswell and just said, let's play in the middle gap and see who's stronger, and TO won. That, you know, that's, we pride ourselves on nuance and depth here, but that was really all the scheme Missouri needed. And then I thought defensively, you know, they were pretty solid in ball screens against Jacoby Gillespie. Tennessee got him a little bit in the second half with some side and empty side ball screen stuff.
Mizzou targeting Trent Burns a little bit.
Targeting Trent Burns, but otherwise it was...
We talked about them possibly needing to like change up how they're using him in ball screens, and getting him at the levels maybe not the best way to use your 7'5" center.
Yeah, but I also thought, you know, when I went back and I looked over Jacoby Gillespie's kind of stats and film, he's always a guy that kind of thrives at throwing those pocket passes and kind of feeding them, and he was able to do that. So I wonder, part of me wonders if that was just like one of those weird wrinkles where the ball screen coverage was right, but the point guard was just really good at threading passes through tight windows. I mean, you could say Trent stayed at the level a bit too long, but he's been pretty good in ball screen coverages against Tyler Tanner. He was pretty good against Josh Hubbard on Saturday at times, you know, and those guys are kind of more midi hunters and they're better at throwing lobs. So his length, I think, matters more there. Jacoby's pretty good at threading some lower passes where his length isn't really as impactful, but I think the bigger deal was the empty side where he didn't have a tag defender to help him out on the back side. There was probably a big one. But I thought that game kind of played out a lot like we talked about a week ago. You just wondered if Missouri was going to be able to go out and execute, and they did. And, you know, obviously to me that resolved a lot of the questions about this team and sort of its tournament aspirations. I think once they got to 5 quad 1 wins and got to 19 overall, I think my stress level went down quite a bit, because the end of the season was going to give them a chance to get one more win and kind of tick off the final boxes. So I think, you know, you can tell me what you think, but I think I felt like a collective just mood shift once they got that result. I think a lot of us have sort of been, you know, looking at, you know, the alternating kind of win-loss pattern and going, okay, they got to get this one. You know, can they, you know, take a pretty good step forward and really start ratcheting down, you know, the play-in talk and the first 4 talk, and they did that. So I just, more broadly, I think the result was good to see them continue to execute against high-level opposition, see guys that are playing well continue to playing well. But I think just psychologically for them, for the coaching staff, and for the fan base, it just feels like things are lighter now as a result of getting that win. And I think that that's really important, you know, at this time of year. You know, we look around and we see a lot of bubble teams absolutely biffing opportunities. For 3 straight weeks, Missouri, I mean, you know, we talked about it a month ago, you know, and I was skeptical that they could do it, but it was, you know, they had a really tough closing stretch. It was going to give them some opportunities, but they had to execute. And you look at it, you know, kind of in the midweek, each of the last 3 weeks, they've gotten a result, and they've just steadily built a resume, steadily built some momentum. And, you know, last Tuesday kind of felt like one of those games, like, okay, now we can all finally really breathe now and go, okay, they've got 5 quad 1 wins. There won't be another bad loss with the way the schedule closes, and they should be able to get a result at Mississippi State. And they backed that up. So I think it was just a game and a night that really lifted some anxiety. And that's really important, because what we saw last year was a team, I think, that was kind of puckering late and kind of clinching up late. And this feels like the opposite this year, where I think they're playing with a little bit more lightness and confidence as they come down the stretch. And that's huge. That's huge at this time of year.
Yeah, I think it's worth sort of pointing out, you know, the stretch of games here, because Missouri's really been playing well. And I wrote about, sort of the month by month thing, and their play over the month of February, I think ended up about 13th or 15th or something like that in the country.
16th is where it went.
So for those who don't know, you can go to barttorvik.com and sort data. It's really a handy tool to sort of look at, how comparative teams are, playing over a certain period of time. And I think you could go back to sort of like post Alabama, and Missouri was kind of starting to put things together. Now, some of that coincides with, okay, you get Mississippi State and South Carolina, two teams that are currently in the KenPom 90s. But for really most of the game against Mississippi State, Missouri was on point.
Yeah.
And they had a couple lulls. There was, we talked about it on the pod. They had the one where, Sean picked up the flagrant. They kind of allowed State to kind of come back at that point. And then post Boateng injury was also, I think, they were about to go up, I think 17, if I remember correctly. And then, the game ended up a little tighter. But, like Mississippi State also hit a 3-pointer with like no time on the clock after a travel.
Yeah.
to make the final margin 5 points. Like, the game wasn't even that close. They go on the road. They beat South Carolina badly. They turn around another road game and win a close one over Texas A&M, who is an NCAA tournament team. You beat a NCAA tournament team on the road in their place. Like, that's a good result. They came home against Texas and played poorly. But then they turn around and they played, 35 great minutes against Vanderbilt. And against Arkansas, they played well. They were at Arkansas, a team that's, obviously they took a loss on the chin at Florida. But Arkansas has been trending towards a quarter, sort of like a 4 to 6 seed land. And that's, those are games that are hard to win. Missouri lost a close-ish game. So then you come home and you get a big result against Tennessee. You go on the road again and you beat Mississippi State emphatically. And you got to the 10-win marker for league play. You got to 20 wins. And you have to be sort of like, looking at the picture and saying, when we have our full lineup, and things weren't perfect for like maybe the first month, but we're really starting to kind of put this together. And this is the team that, we thought we had in the offseason before we kind of got, dinged with, some bumps in the, November and December.
I think that excuses some of the rotational missteps in November and December with the jumbo lineups and in terms of how they were using some guys. I don't think it entirely excuses the outright burying of Sebastian Mack either. I don't want to say that, it was purely the injuries that were a cause here. There were some rotational decisions that I think, even in hindsight, you can critique pretty validly.
Yeah.
I think, so I don't want to lose sight of that. I think that,
Well, they did have to kind of like find their rotation, and for whatever reason, it wasn't working.
And so I think the one thing I sort of will look back at, I think when we have time coming out of the regular season, is I really want to go back and look at those January games, particularly, the stretch kind of through Ole Miss, up until Mississippi State. Because I think you can look back at some of those games and you can clearly see, I think they were trying to figure out, how do we play with a shortened bench? Because you could look at those and you could see some weird lineups before media timeouts where they were maybe trying to rest guys, and that was causing offensive lulls, and then they were putting themselves in a hole there. There were clear lineups and roles that were not working. I wrote about one a couple of weeks ago. That one had been persistent since January. But since then, they've cut that lineup out. They've really pared back the guard group that's the crux of that lineup, which is Robinson, Barrett, Stone together. So I think the thing that you have to wonder is, one, they got healthy. They went through January and they kept trying to maybe be playing 8 or 9 deep when the rotation didn't support that.
Right.
They chopped it down. There were still some extraneous lineups they would stumble into, particularly the one, like I said, that I wrote about that was also bad against the press. It took nearly blowing a loss to Vanderbilt to stamp that one out. And, I'll have a piece about it tomorrow. Trent Burns emerging has been a godsend for them because they needed to get to 8 bodies. Particularly, they could not go into March with just one legitimate 5. And Trent Burns is not, the piece is long and it's in depth, but I think it's important to say what he's done, just because I think it's important to look at kind of his development and how this has happened. But it's not an expansive role. He's playing 16 minutes a game. But you look at what he does, Missouri, if you really look granularly at what happens when he's on the floor, Missouri's like allowing 0.85 points per possession defensively. He's averaging 1 point per possession when he touches the ball. So what he's giving you is plus 15 kind of when he's on the floor in terms of a net rating. That's critical to have 2 bigs that way. It's on low usage. It's not really like highlight level stuff. A lot of his defensive impact is as a help defender and on the occasional post up. But that's really important if your job is to keep people out of the paint and deter rim attacks. So he's given them the absolute kind of right functional big they need at the right time of the year. And to have 8 bodies and figuring out how they need to sub, you can look at the sub pattern for the last 3 weeks and you can kind of see, okay, they figured it out over the last 2 weeks, how they need to sub. They made a meal of the rotation the first 2 months, but they figured it out in the last 3 or 4 weeks, kind of how they need to manage this one. Mm-hmm. And if they can keep it up, it's going to get them home and give them some momentum. So I think that's just the biggest thing is, do you look at January and see, mistakes, or do you see a staff that's trying to adapt in real time? I think there's arguments either way, but I think that's what sticks with me over the last couple of weeks is saying, okay, how much of this is, stuff that you can critique them for versus how much of this is just us needing to understand this is what recalibrating your rotation on the fly looks like. I don't know if we can properly portion that out, but I think that's kind of where my head has settled at after the last week is appreciating the place they've gotten to, but trying to figure out kind of how do we make heads or tails of the process that led up to it.
Yeah, I think like it's certainly one of those things, and we don't have to get like super in depth on like college basketball at large here. There's plenty of off season to talk about like what other teams did, and but you look around just the SEC, and obviously there are games Missouri would like to have back, but you're looking at LSU and Ole Miss, who are basically in the basement of the league. LSU currently 3-13. Ole Miss is 4-12. Hilariously, Ole Miss went to Auburn and won. Great stuff, guys. But at the same time, so like you lost this game. Missouri was kind of going through things at that point. But you look at both of those teams, both portal heavy. Mm-hmm. Both experienced rosters, got a lot of old guys on both rosters. And it seems like you're really kind of getting this, across college basketball a lot is it's taking teams longer to kind of figure out who they are and like what their best fits are. Some teams figure it out like Missouri has. Some teams don't.
Yeah.
And then, sure, like there are some teams that just have an overall talent advantage and maybe don't have to like worry about that. But I think for programs that are kind of stuck in the middle, like are we going to be, in the tournament or not in the tournament? Missouri has taken a step forward and, where other teams have taken a step back, and they're certainly, proving that, with the right mix of guys and with, kind of like finally settling on, what your rotation is going to be and getting, some good minutes from, unexpected good minutes from somebody like Trent Burns. I think you're right, and that helped a lot. But I think like all these things sort of combined have, set them up in a way that other teams like just haven't seen. And I think like that's at least worth noting, right?
Yeah.
This isn't, there's no science to it. We do talk a lot about math and numbers, but there's no science to basketball. It's all people, and sometimes you get it wrong.
I do think this is. I'd come back to this point though. Go look at returning production, and then go look at the standings right now. Missouri was tops in returning production. It's tied for fourth. Arkansas was second in returning production. It's third. Florida was third in returning production. It's first. Vanderbilt was fourth. They're kind of in a weird tiebreaker situation down around sixth or seventh. Alabama was sixth in returning production. They're second. What are you seeing there? A lot of teams towards the top of the standings brought back a lot.
I would also point out, like, Alabama, like, they're two starting guards, or at least starting level guards. I know Holloway kind of came off the bench last year with Sears there, but like, returning production is important, but also, like, the guys that you are bringing back, like, who are they and what do they do? And having, like, LeBaron Philon and Aiden Holloway, having Anthony Robinson and having Mark Mitchell, having Thomas Houck and having Alex Condon, Ruben Chinyelu, that's all really good. Arkansas has been boosted by having that, plus having a potential All-American come in at point guard.
But Arkansas had
that's what I mean.
Yeah, they had a core they could plug those guys into.
Yeah, so they were fortunate in that they had these guys that were already there, and then, oh, by the way, we're also adding a guy like this, and so I'm agreeing with your point. I'm just sort of I think over explaining some of the like I do think it's important for Missouri that, like, Mark Mitchell not only came back but came back better. Like, he's been awesome. Yeah. And he's been awesome all year. And even in games where he doesn't score, like, he's doing so much to help Missouri. Like, it's invaluable to have returning good players and guys that are able to still improve on their game as they get older.
Yeah, what's going to stink for him is you want to see how big the SEC first team's going to be, because if you limited it to just 5 guys, he's going to get stuck behind, like, Thomas Houck. Think about that. Or Alex Condon. That's crazy. Like, any other year, we'd be saying lead pipe lock first teamer, but Florida brought back the best front court in college basketball, and it's like, Mark's been awesome. But, like, if you were to ask me,
I'm not even sure Condon's been, like, their best.
Houck's been their best guy. Houck's been their best guy.
I was going to say Chinielu's been, like, so good.
Yeah. So
he's great defensively. He's great around the rim.
But I think the point that we're making here is Missouri. I think what frustrated us for so long was that Missouri did the thing that you want a team to do. It bet on retention. It bet on continuity. It bet on all the things that, if you look at teams that make deep runs in March they've got a nucleus of 5 to 6 guys that have been together multiple years, that play 50+% of minutes, and they're a core. And you looked at what Missouri had, and they were pretty close to that. And I think what was frustrating for the first couple of months is it felt like they were fighting a natural direction for this team. Now, maybe things didn't pan out the way they thought they would with Sebastian Mack. Ant Robinson has regressed more than we thought. There are things sometimes that, like you said, people are people, and you can't always account for those things. But I think what's saved them, in a certain sense, is they did have a core. They had a Mark Mitchell. They had an Ant Robinson. They had a Trent Pierce. They've had, even a Jacob Cruz has been here for 2 years. They had that guy. They've had multiple year guys here. Even, like, though Trent Pierce didn't play last year, he's been in the program 2 years. T.O. Barrett's been in the program 2 years.
Trent Burns.
Yeah, Trent Burns has been in the program 2 years. So what they've got,
they had
it. They had enough guys who had been together across multiple years, and I think that matters. That have been through stuff together, that can look at each other and say, okay, we've experienced all of this together. We can figure it out together. How many we've seen some teams this year that were portal builds that were hyped up. I'm thinking like an NC State or some other programs like that, or Washington was hyped by some people who haven't made it work. But everyone said, oh, look, they're old. They got all this proven production. But they didn't have those guys who had those experiences together and didn't have that kind of chemistry together in those relationships. And I think that, this is kind of one of those soft skill things. Missouri had the production. They had the minutes. They didn't have to replace necessarily. But I think what they had was they had a culture in place that could withstand some things. And we'll see how it goes through this week, and we'll see what happens when March gets here. But I think if you believe in culture and you believe in all that kind of soft, squishy stuff that you can't always quantify, this last 4 weeks or so has affirmed kind of your view on some of that. There's some statistical markers you can look at around that, but ultimately I think it comes down to the personalities involved, and it looks like Missouri had the right mix in the guys who maintained enough buy-in to get them where they are. Now they got to finish it. They got to finish strong, but I think there's a nice sort of affirmation in watching this happen, because you wonder coming out of a bumpy stretch in January if they could hold it together and capitalize on this stretch, and they have. So I think that's where your optimism comes from.
You mentioned NC State. They just lost by 29 points at home to the Duke Blue Devils, and that's their third loss in a row, including an overtime loss to Notre Dame, who has gone in the tank. Now, in Notre Dame's defense, not only is their coach hurt, but their two top scorers are also hurt.
Yeah.
Anybody who didn't know, Mike Shrewsbury tore his Achilles, I think.
Yep.
You know, at a game the other day. I think that was last weekend.
Yeah.
Not comical, but also like it's not funny. Yeah. So like mixed bag on some of the portal stuff. So let's get back to the Tigers. Tomorrow night, it's an early tip, a 6 p.m. tip in Norman.
Get that double bye so we can keep the early tip theme rolling, guys. Let's stay out of these 9 p.m. Eastern tips for Matt. Let's stay out of those.
So
do it for yourselves and do it for me.
If OU had better late game luck, they would probably be a bubble team and maybe in the tournament, because they've won their first game of conference play and then lost 9 in a row, but they've since gone 4-2. So they've beaten Vanderbilt, Georgia, Auburn, and LSU. Not exactly murderer's row, but there's some quality wins in there. LSU was on the road, Vandy was on the road, Georgia and Auburn were at home. They lost pretty badly at Tennessee, and then lost at home to Texas A&M in a close game. So they are 5-11, but this is a game that I would approach with a good amount of caution for Tiger fans, because one, Missouri has not always had a lot of luck going to Norman and trying to win. Wrote about that last year actually, and it sort of held up. Lloyd Noble tends to not be the most intimidating environment these days. But OU is their 50th in KenPom. They're coached well. They can score the ball. They don't defend great.
That was the case last year.
But they score it well. They're going to be tough at home. Missouri is favored to lose this by 3 points. If you're going by the KenPom projection, 79-76. It's not a game that they need, the Tigers, but I think what you're trying to do here is you're trying to set yourself up for a possible double bye, and if you want that, you're probably going to have to win your last 2 games.
Yep. The reason why this game bothers me is because if you go look at KenPom's luck rating, OU is 351st in the country. They should have, based on predictive models, 3 more wins. If you were to give those to them, and that's, in that period when they struggled in close games in SEC play, they should probably be 8-10 in the SEC standings, which with their, overall strength of schedule and stuff like that, they should be close to the bubble. They should be where Texas is right now, or Georgia is right now.
Yeah.
They're offensively, they are awesome. Like we talked about in the preseason, like we talked about in the first matchup, Pack, Brown, Davis, awesome. They got 3 great scorers. The big rotations kind of, functional. Darion Reed has kind of taken a back seat in recent games to Jaden Jones, but Reed was a former 5-star guy. They've got plenty of weapons in probably their first 4 or 5. The question, again, is going to be depth. Do they have the depth here to get this done? But they've played well at home. They continue to score the ball efficiently. their top three guys. I'm going to look at it right now. I haven't checked since last week where they win the SEC. Yeah, Nigel Pack on 25% usage, 118 offensive rating. Xavier Brown, 116 O rating on 23% usage. Tay Davis, 108 offensive rating. They've got three hyper efficient scorers that can give them buckets. If Reed, is kind of a really nice role player who's kind of found his level in SEC play. The question is, can they get some production out of a big? Can Wagi, help them some nights defensively and as a rim protector? But they don't always get enough from their secondary group of Forsyth, Jones, and Alonsev. Missouri, I think, was able to score efficiently and target them. In Columbia, I think they'll be able to score again. The question is, as Missouri's improved down the stretch here, they've kind of had some slippage defensively. Now, that's because they've played some teams like Arkansas and taken some, they played, I can't remember what other game where they had I can look it up, but they had one other game where the offensive rating or the defensive rating wasn't all that good, but they're going on the road to play.
Vanderbilt
was not good.
Did a lot of catch
damage. That's it. Yeah, I'm looking at that now. Did a lot of damage late while playing catch up. So that might be skewing some things for them a little bit, but this is a game that just bothers me because it's Oklahoma, whose record is clearly not as good as what their talent and their production would indicate. They're still fighting their asses off for Porter. They didn't pack it in after the 1-9 start. Missouri has struggled there historically. They struggled there a year ago.
They beat LSU by 16.
Right. They did not mail that in. They have absolutely not packed the tents up. So, Missouri's playing well, and that's not to take anything away from what Missouri's doing, but OU is fighting with every bit that they have. The only bad loss they've really taken right now was kind of at Tennessee, but they're fighting their asses off each time out. And, you wonder from Missouri's side if they take a little bit of a breather in this one too. They got to 10 wins. Maybe some of the outside noise has leaked in. We'll see. You hope if you're Missouri that they look at this and say, no, we're going to keep the pedal down. We're going to keep playing hard, and we're going to go get a double bye, and we're going to absolutely improve our seed. So I'm going to be fascinated to see kind of where their mentality is, because last year when they went to OU, I think that was a worse performance than what they put together at Arkansas. They just looked completely disengaged in that game. But circumstances are different. They seem like they've locked in. So we'll see what they do tomorrow night, but the record for OU is deceptive. This is a tricky one.
Well, yeah, and I would point out, we said the same thing about OU last year. They did end up making, the tournament, but mostly off the strength of the league. That's not going to happen this year. But, last year they had a win over Mississippi State. They had really, really close losses in the two games right before Missouri, losing to Kentucky at home. I don't know if anybody remembers that game. That was the Otega-Owe game. And then Ole Miss, they lost on a 3-point game on the road, and then they came home and they beat Missouri pretty soundly. Now, Mizzou was able to kind of keep that game close, at certain points, but they never really threatened Oklahoma.
No.
If there's something that you're kind of hoping to see, I think for me is how aggressive are they early, kind of getting to the rim. Mm-hmm. How easy are they able to kind of score in the first 5 minutes? And then at some point, it's one thing to kind of go up Mississippi State and get up as much as you did and not really need to, make jump shots. But somebody's going to have to step up and make some jumpers. And, Trent Pierce has shown he can do that. Anthony Robinson's been on a nice little streak. It'd be nice to, have Jaden Stone kind of get off his... 2-game slide here. But this is a game that they can win. They probably should win. Or, maybe that's being unfair to say that they should win a game they're projected to lose. But I feel like when you take both teams and you look at who Missouri has kind of become and who Oklahoma is, I think Missouri should win this game.
Yeah, it should be a tight road win. And I think the other thing to point out here is Missouri's been nails in close games this year. OU has not been. So I think that's relevant. It's not a trait that carries over year to year. But within a season, the ability for some teams to close and others not is a very real thing. And so if it's close late, you would probably trust Missouri to get it over the line and execute more than OU would. OU has struggled at that. The game on Saturday is more interesting to me because we talked about it last week. Arkansas really got kind of mixed performances from their two stars. It was their bench that kind of carried them. On Saturday, nobody showed up on the road at Florida. Now, Florida had a lot to do with that, but
Florida was like they were charged and ready to go for that game. I think
they wanted to brawl literally. Or Todd gave the impression that he wanted to brawl until he pushed an assistant in front of him and said, "You go deal with Cal. I'll chirp. You go deal with him."
His giant assistant coach.
Yeah, you go deal with him. I'm going to go pull this up just because I want to make sure that I'm looking at the right box score here. I mean, Malik Thomas was good on 12% usage in that game. Acuff was good on 26% usage, mostly living at the foul line. That guy, but that's kind of what he does, is get to the line. The bigger deal was Billy Richmond giving him 21 and then getting 16 from Malik Ewan. Ewan after that, put together a good outing at Texas A&M, at home against Texas A&M. I haven't looked enough at his road splits to kind of justify the breakdown here, but I think we've always talked about it's harder sometimes for role players to translate away from their building. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be interesting to see if, Richmond and Ewan and Pringle sort of show up and are able to deliver the same kind of performances they did, 2 weeks later. For Missouri, this is kind of one of those topper games to me. If you're 11-6, it'll be interesting what the stakes are, because can you go into this game with an opportunity if you beat Arkansas? Combined with your win over Florida, might push you into the number 3 seed. So if you've beaten Oklahoma, you've got a chance at a 3 seed. It's senior day in your building. Are you locked in and ready to go? I think we know, kind of from what we talked about a couple weeks ago, the matchups here and the style aren't necessarily a great match for Missouri. We know that the overall talent level across Arkansas's roster is probably a little bit better. But does the environment and the circumstances change how this one plays out? So that's what's going to be interesting to me. And if Missouri has a chance to solidify a double bye or that number 3 seed, the stakes for it may be a little bit higher than for Arkansas, because I think Arkansas was going into Florida thinking, okay, maybe we can put ourselves in a position for a share of the SEC title. That's out the window now. Would they look at playing for the number 3 seed as kind of a step back, whereas Missouri's going to see it as playing, for something to for something to gain. So it'll be interesting to see how both teams approach that, and just sort of what the environment is like, and whether or not the Tigers can close out it, on a strong note.
Here's why I think they should make their best effort to win their next 2 games. Missouri has yet to win 12 games in the SEC. They've won 11 games in their first season. That was Frank Haith's second year. I think a lot of you will remember that as being a little bit disappointed. It was disappointing because the SEC was not the same quality of league as it is now.
Never forget SEC basketball fever.
And then Dennis Gates won 11 in his first season. The next best record for this team is 10-8. So there's been a host of 10-8s. There's been a couple 11-7s. There's been 0 12-6s. I think that would be sort of like a nice marker for this program, to say that, like, even in a year where we had some struggles, like, we still found a way and we improved on the best finish that Missouri has had in the SEC, and so it's going to be tough because you're going to Oklahoma, a place that they didn't play very well last year, and historically have not always played well, and then coming home to Arkansas, and Arkansas is talented. But that's that's this league now, and it's something that, like, I always like to kind of point out, like, when we talk about the historical context of, I know Kentucky fans were like always irate at John Calipari this last 3 or 4 years for not being as elite as he was when he began. It's just like, well, he was also he was basically like playing in the American Conference in some of those years. And the SEC is not like that anymore. Like, there are a lot of teams that are committed and have resources, and that's why it's the best overall league in college basketball.
The one thing that I think stands out when you look at the SEC tiebreakers is how many times have we talked about Missouri's job is to consistently beat teams like the Mississippi States, the Texas A&Ms, the ones that are in that kind of usually in that middle of the pack, and show that you can routinely beat them and you can pass them. You look at the standings, Missouri owns a tiebreaker over everybody in the middle of that cluster of the SEC standings except Texas. They did exactly what we've said they needed to do for 6, 7, 8 years now, which is consistently beat the teams that are in the middle of that pack and then position yourself to break into that top 4. I don't think anybody would have come into this year and said, you got to contend for an SEC title. But the preseason forecast had them between 5th and 9th. They're going to finish somewhere in that range. So they're going to meet preseason expectations. I think for me, if it's 12-6 or 11-7, the record might be secondary to, can you get to that 3 or 4 seed? Can you show that in a reset year, you not only recovered from a poor start, but you passed people. You got into that top 4. Because I think the one thing that's interesting is this is a year where the SEC in a lot of ways was resetting itself. We had Bruce Pearl leaving. We've had a lot of roster turnover. This was kind of one of those years where, we talked about in the preseason, and Watkins and I have talked about a lot on the boards, is this was a year to start moving past some programs. Kentucky's reset. Auburn has reset. There are other programs out there that I think are a little bit vulnerable as well. Can you push up the standings? Finishing 3rd or 4th this year, I think, would be a tangible proof that that's possible. Going into an offseason where you're going to add some higher-end recruits, it hasn't always been smooth, but I think if you get to the end of the year where you're saying, okay, we exceeded our preseason forecast, we're going to retain some core pieces, and we're going to add to it, that's a good place to be. Now, you want to play well in the NCAA tournament. That frames how a lot of people view seasons. But to me, the next 2 weeks are kind of about saying, okay, we've positioned ourselves to take that next step. We're passing peers in this conference. Now it's about making that jump into perennial contender status. So I think that's kind of what the bigger kind of like thematic stakes are for them as they come down the stretch. It's about changing the perception of the program, or starting to change that. And this is where you do it. This is the time of year when people start tuning in, start paying attention, start adding freighted expectations to stuff. Can you meet them, and can you start exceeding them?
Yeah, so that's where we are. 2 more games of the regular season. Missouri's hit the 20-win mark early, hit the 10-win mark in the SEC early. So
20-10-5.
Go do the rest. Go do the rest. And I think last year, after they beat Alabama, Missouri sort of felt like they were content. They played like a team that was sort of happy with what they had accomplished. And I'm really hoping that we see a team tomorrow night that looks like it is not content with what they've accomplished, and they can kind of carry the momentum that they played with through February all the way into March and have a strong March. But as always, we'll see. We'll watch the games. We'll talk about them. So you and I are going to turn this off and go back to our nights. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to another live episode of Rock M Radio. This is Dive Cuts. I'm Sam Snelling. That's Matt Harris. We'll be back next week to review what these Tigers did in their final 2 games, look ahead to the SEC tournament, and all that jazz. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and have a great night.